themselves and are not reliant long-term on social policies of the government or the state. So thinking about these two elements together is absolutely crucial. And this is why we focus so much on job creation for different parts of the Indian labor force, particularly those where we see currently labor force participation levels being very low. The other element is the structural transformation bit. Now, some of you might know who've kind of looked at the economic literature, economic development usually means structural transformation from agriculture to industry and later on to services. India always has been somewhat different in the sense that services have played a much larger role early on in its development. But it's not alone. When we see at the global development now, the traditional focus on exports of industrial goods is less and less of a job driver on its own. It's still important, and there are still opportunities for India. But we need to see a much broader set of industries as job creation engines as we move forward. So simply believing that manufacturing growth will create sufficient jobs for Indians is unlikely to work, given the technology and trade reality that India is facing today. So where are we going from here? What are then the policy changes that we see are necessary for India? Maybe the most important one is here to the left. So how are we changing our industrial and regional policies? There are a lot of good initiatives going on, and you see here local action, there's aspirational districts, smart cities, national campaigns, and things like Make in India and so forth. What we would like to see is a new focus on sectoral growth initiatives that are different from the old type of policies. How are they different? Well, the first thing is that they are not defined by one individual policy intervention. The production-linked incentives are a good instrument, but we know that success depends not only on these capital incentives. It depends on regulatory changes. It depends on workforce skills. It depends on appropriate changes in trade policy. So what we're hoping to achieve through these specific growth initiatives is to have an integrated agenda of policy changes that goes beyond the kind of narrow silos of policies that we've seen in the past. We would also like to see a much stronger focus on location. We know from our work that economic activity is not kind of equally distributed across the country. There are hubs and clusters in particular categories, in particular locations of the country. So we want to make sure that these initiatives focus on the particular strength of individual districts and locations within India and mobilize the business community and the government that is relevant for these type of locations. So it's about doing things differently that is really critical. The second piece is changing social policy. Now, India has made enormous progress in terms of being more effective in the way that social policies are being delivered. What we would like to argue for is a better integration of social policies as an enabler and driver also of economic growth, not as something that's totally different. I think only then can we see policies that drive sustainability and actually enable people to sustain themselves, not being permanently dependent on the social policies. The third piece focuses on what we need to do to improve our business environment. Again, India has made enormous progress in physical assets. You now have enough electricity generation capacity to serve the entire country. The problem, much less and less, is the capital stock. It is the market structure. In many of these sectors, we lack effective markets that really ensure that we're using the assets that we have here. This has to do with liberalization and removing further rounds of regulation that still exists, but it's also about creating an environment that makes productive use of the assets that exist more likely. And then finally, productivity and jobs are being created in firms. We know that India still has a very bifurcated distribution of companies. A few large, quite successful, also internationally successful firms, but then many automized, very small, kind of fragmented companies that do not have the capacity and the ability to grow and really create better and more productive jobs. So also here, I think we need a stronger set of policies to do so. Now, let me give you a little bit more examples of how this might look like. So let's start with this one. Healthcare services, and this might be a surprise, but healthcare services is an area where it's obvious that India has much more demand than what is currently served. India is not spending as much on healthcare than other countries, and much more of the spending comes out of the pocket of private citizens than government is spending here. We also know that healthcare services is an area where women already are much more numerous than in other sectors. So the entry opportunities for women to work here are clear. What it will require then, though, is not just more capital and more spending, but actually structural change. We need to go away from a healthcare system that very much aspires to look like an advanced Western economy and that makes better use of what you already have in terms of your labor force in India. Not as much a kind of high skill activities for or use of high skilled labor for every function, but using those people that are there. A lot that could be done. Agriculture. In agricultural export, India also has huge opportunities, and this is a market that will only be growing globally. Again, you've moved away from a country that was not self-sustaining to one that can feed both Indians, but also provide agricultural goods to others. And there are great plans already out there that can be used in order to create new opportunities. Finally, as a third example, environmental equipment. So from solar cells to wind energy equipment to other things. India is a growing market. India has enormous ambitions to use renewable energy, which is much cheaper now than traditional CO2-based forms of energy. Only yesterday, one of your largest companies announced a major focus on renewable energy. How can we unlock this area? Well, it has a lot to do actually with the predictability of demand. The more you can ensure that there will be more demand for these type of equipment in India, the more also international companies will be willing to invest. It's about the integration of policy tools. The will is there, the ambition is there, the opportunity is there. It's about coordinating the right type of steps. And then India can be one of the global leaders in producing and applying these types of technologies. Social policies and the integration of social and economic development, just to give you some examples. So in order for women to be able to work, we have to provide childcare services. We also need to ensure that public safety is there so that the women can feel safe to go to jobs. These are not just social policies. These are actually economic policies because they enable participation. Same in education, same in healthcare. We need to look at these things not as separate, but as reinforcing parts of an overall agenda. There's lots to do, and there's a lot of economic opportunity here in terms of the jobs that can be created. Talked about the restructuring of markets and regulation. Again, it's much less about mobilizing capital to invest into a physical capital stock. It's about creating more effective markets. Effective markets does not just mean cutthroat competition. It means a market environment that benefits those that provide the best value and develop and become better over time. And that's not always the case on Indian markets today. Finally, competitive firms, and here are a number of examples of what needs to be done. There's a lot of changes in the business environment, but also individual initiatives that could be taken in order to strengthen the growth of especially medium-sized companies. Now, let's be clear, this is a long-term task. This is not going to become a quick fix of those type of issues. But it's important to put this in the center, because without competitive firms, we will not get that type of job creation that we need for our labor force to be employed. So these were kind of the four key pieces of the policy agenda. And if you look at the report, you'll find more individual elements, both on individual sectors to mobilize kind of priority policy areas, but also individual pilots that we suggest that could be tried. Now, how to get it done, how to implement it. This will require a step change in government, what we called here competitive government. It's about coordination across government, both across the geographic levels, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but also across the functional dimensions of government. And I'll talk about that as well. Then, of course, it's about the capacity within government. So enabling people, training people. But one of the things that I've learned from the interactions that we had with people is that oftentimes it's actually not at the local level, the lack of skills or knowledge. It's the structures that don't bring out the best out of the people at that local level. A lot can be achieved by people if they're just putting in the right type of context. And I think this is why efforts like the Aspirational Districts Initiative are so interesting, because they give individual that opportunity. Finally, and Professor Porter mentioned that as well, it's really also about how the government engages with the private sector. There's a danger of finger pointing and saying, oh, you know, you in government are lazy, or you're just making life impossible for us as companies. At the same time as there is a danger of government pointing at the private sector and saying, oh, you're just following your private interests. You're not helping India. We need to find a better way to engage with each other. And that will be a possibility, I think, to really move the dialogue forward and the collaboration forward. We need each other. We need better government, but better government also needs the engagement of the private sector to succeed. Now, just to be a little bit more specific, one key element is really in terms of the coordination across the geographic levels of India. A lot of progress, I think, has been made already in the relationship between the central government and the state level government, at least in fiscal terms, but I think more needs to be done. Thinking really about the way of how central government can empower state level governments, providing incentives, providing matching funds, providing information, providing guidance, but having the decisions being made in the local context, because that's where the information is to make the appropriate choices that fit individual locations. But it's not only states. India needs a much stronger level of local and metropolitan area governance and government in order to really grow and use the potential that it has. Urbanization levels in this country are still much lower than in many other countries. And part of that is because there is no effective policy structure at that level. We make concrete proposals here in the report on how you might start to address these type of issues. Again, this is difficult, this is long-term, but it's probably one of the most consequential changes that India has to make. The other is the cross-functional collaboration. And here, you see here the number of ministries and departments at the national level, much higher, by the way, than, for example, in the United States. The problem is that you end up with people that are only optimizing within their sliver of government. I'm in charge of skills, so I'll do what's best for the skills agenda. I'm in charge for export, so I only focus on that. Economic success depends on how these things interact. And so we need to get better. We need to find instruments that allow very strong collaboration across these types of institutions. There are a lot of examples in other countries to look at, but the solution has to fit for India. So I think this is something to really think about and work with for us to make Indian government to be more effective, not just in the functional silos, but in the overall competitiveness that the country needs. As I said before, what we outlined in this roadmap is an agenda for a lot of individual parts of government. But what we would really like to see is a dialogue, is a conversation about how this roadmap affects all of government. All ministries should think about, how do these aspirations, how do these development principles affect us? And how can we engage with the type of policy priorities laid out? We also need to recognize that the world is changing every day. And so it's not just about implementing a set agenda, but it's about how we can use these principles to respond to things like rising inflation, like more tension that there is in the global economy. Only then is this a roadmap that actually helps us to deal with these challenges of the future, rather than just being something that needs to be executed on. Over time, as I said, I think the real impact will come both through the policies, but then through the institutional changes, and ultimately through a change in thinking that puts competitiveness, understood here both as productivity, but also as mobilizing all resources, all parts of the Indian economy, much more into the center. So finally then, if we're successful, if you are successful, I think the future really is bright for India. There's so many things that are going your way that create opportunities for this country. As a non-Indian, I can only cheer you on, because I think if India is successful, the benefits for the rest of us will be huge. The world will be a better place if India is successful. So I hope that this work, and again, I'm grateful to Amit and all the colleagues that we've had a chance to work with over the last couple of months, gives you a little bit of a direction to change your thinking and implement things slightly differently. I wish you all the best on that path. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Christian, for such a great presentation. I think it shows that we have really worked on this for the last 12 months on the idea. And I profoundly believe that whatever we have said, we say it with a lot of conviction, and we say it with a lot of analysis and data to back up. And I'm convinced in my mind as well that India would actually and can be one of the most successful nations in the next 25 years. It has huge potential. We just have to run towards that potential in the years to come. So thank you, Christian. Thank you, Mike, especially for really supporting and guiding this work, because it wouldn't have really happened without these two gentlemen. So without further ado, I think one of the most important tasks, and I'll request Dr. De Broglie to come in and give his keynote address. He has seen the report. I'm sure he has some remarks to make and some ideas to share. Dr. De Broglie, over to you. And as you know, Dr. De Broglie is the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. We couldn't really have done this without him and without his thinking and without his support. Dr. De Broglie, over to you, please.
Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Professor Porter, Professor Christian Kettles, and Professor Amit Kapoor for having done this. This is a study that's been done by the Institute for Competitiveness. It's not a study that's done by the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. It's their study. We are partnering with them in the launch, in the dissemination, in the propagation. This report has already been summarized in a very wonderful way by Christian. We will put this report up on our website. I'm sure IFC will do the same. So everyone will get an opportunity to read this report. The report is on India at 100. 25 years from now, we are in the 75th year of independence. And it's looking forward 25 years and suggesting what India should do to make India a more prosperous country, a better governed country in 2047. 25 years ago, it was 1997. In 1997, had people been asked about what would happen in 2022, no one would have got it right. Would you know that Rishabh Pant would become a great cricketer? No, Rishabh Pant had just been born in 1997. In 1997, we went through two prime ministers. Deve Gowda, I.K. Gujral, we headed into elections, midterm elections. Generally, there was an air of despondency. So just as Christian said, when we have something like this does not suggest that everything is going to be exactly as predicted. And certainly the track record of economists who do predictions is not very good, unless they post facto rationalize why their predictions went wrong in the first place. So one is talking about trends. There are many people internal to the system who have also examined and are in the process of examining what India needs to do to be a more prosperous country, a better governed country in 2047. This is a useful external analytical lens using a particular structure that is used by Michael Porter to examine the same theme. And any such analysis has a certain value addition. 2047, you can sit down with your own calculators, these days even on the mobiles, and figure out what India's per capita income is likely to be. Depending on whatever assumptions you have about real growth rate, whatever assumptions you have about the exchange rate, and if you're doing it in nominal terms, whatever assumptions you have about the rate of inflation. And the nature of the exponential function is such that even if you're relatively conservative about real rates of growth, India won't do that badly. 99.99 to the power 365 and 100.01 to the power 365. Often we tend to think there is not much difference between the two. Try it out on the calculator. The function explodes because of its exponential nature. So even if you have relatively conservative real rates of growth, relatively conservative, 7.5%, we'll get to a per capita income of about 10,000 US dollars. And we'll get to a total size of the economy of a little less than 20 trillion US dollars in 2047. Which means India will be in the upper middle income category, not higher income category. It also means that the nature of Indian society will be completely transformed, the likes of which we cannot fully appreciate and comprehend today. The question to ask is, what does one need to do to get from that 10,000 US dollars to something like 12,000 US dollars plus, which will make India a higher income country. What does one need to do to get from that rate of growth of 7 to 7.5% as default to something like 8 and 8.5%? That's really the nature of the transformation. And there are different ways to slice this, some of which have been attempted in this report. One way to slice this is to look at the four major drivers of growth: consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. As of today, the net export scenario is somewhat gloomy, but maybe it won't be. So one particular way to slice it is to use these four major drivers of the national income identity. What do we need to do? A second way to slice it is to do a sectoral slice and look at the primary sector, the secondary sector, the tertiary sector, and list out the reforms needed in those. A third way to slice it is in terms of what economists tend to do, is to look at the factor inputs: labor, capital, land, and the rest is productivity, and build in provisions for efficient land markets, efficient labor markets, efficient capital markets, and the rest is productivity, realizing, of course, what the report said and what Christian himself said is the great heterogeneity among states, so that different states are at different levels of development. A final way to slice it is in terms of what I just said, the disparate levels of development and growth in different states. Because what happens to India is an aggregate of what happens to the states. And unless the states jack up their growth records, the overall growth record for India is not going to be that high either. But this isn't about GDP alone. GDP is an aggregate measure. It's a useful measure, but it isn't about GDP alone. And most people who criticize GDP as a measure sometimes do not realize that Simon Kuznets stated all of these criticisms, which we tend to recycle, in 1938 when he presented his report to the US Senate. But this income is a means to an objective. And what is that objective? That objective is a better standard of living, which also this report talks about. So 10,000 US dollar per capita income in 2047 also means that India will move into the high human development category. The HDI level will be more than 0.80. Why HDI? Well, it's useful to revisit the discussion that took place when UNDP first produced the HDI in 1990. Because many things that we talk about are correlated with one another. So we can have a whole lot of complicated measures, but in the end, particularly from the policy point of view, it's useful to keep things slightly simple, and hence the HDI. That's the reason I'm mentioning the HDI. In passing, let me also mention the issue of inequality, which is mentioned in this report, and Christian also mentioned it in his presentation. When there is fast growth, inequality tends to increase. Theoretically, empirically, fast growth is correlated with urbanization, and urbanization is often correlated with an increase in inequality. Kushnet's Oshima. Inequality of what form? Depends on the metric. Because there is an inequality that's based on wealth. That's a stock. Wealth is a stock. There is an inequality in the distribution of assets. There can be an inequality in the distribution of income. There can be an inequality that is spatial in nature. Which particular inequality are we talking about? the report talks about income inequality. All right. Where do we get the data for income inequality? Obvious question to ask. Well, IFC has got it from the World Inequality Report. But nonetheless, one should ask the question, how on earth do you get data on income distributions? Because they don't exist in India. NSS only does surveys on consumption expenditure. It's true, inequality in the distribution of income will be more than inequality in the distribution of consumption expenditure. But how do we compute income inequality for India? And what is a high level of income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, so that we should be alarmed? People who have done work on inequality will say we need to worry about the Gini coefficient if it is more than 0.5. Something less than that, we need not worry. Okay. So the World Inequality Report, which is cited in this, what data does it have? It actually has data for the year 2011-12. The NSS Consumption Expenditure Survey for the year 2011-12. So in a sense, that data is more than 10 years old. Secondly, so A, it is not income, it's consumption expenditure. B, it is not 2022, it's 2011-12. C, the Gini coefficient is 0.35. With a Gini coefficient of 0.35, should I really worry? Yes, it increased, World Inequality Database, from 0.32 to 0.35. Should I worry about that? But more importantly, there are several things that this government has been doing since May 2014 to address not inequality, but address inequity. And there's a big difference between the two. Inequity is lack of equity in access. It's like students getting an equal chance to get admitted into an educational institution. That's equity or lack. Income is an outcome. And income inequality being low is like saying that all students must pass with the same marks. The two ideas are not the same. And since May 2014, as has been documented in the dashboards, as has been documented in something like the Aspirational Districts Program, this government has been providing physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, financial inclusion, roads, water, electricity, gas connections, so on and so forth, to ensure precisely that equity becomes much, much more. There is one thing this report does not touch upon, and it shouldn't, which is reforms and all of this. They're about markets. But markets are conceptual structures. A market isn't an agricultural mandi where I go and transact. So all markets function in a certain institutional setting, the historical context. And that historical context is set by the fact that we have a constitution which is based on the Government of India Act of 1935, which determines that we have a certain configuration of states, which determines that we have the 7th schedule, which leads to certain subjects being union government list, concurrent list, state government list. And the Constitution also brings to mind the functioning of Parliament, the functioning of legislative assemblies, the number of states and the different layers at which optimal public expenditure takes place, the generation of revenue for financing that public expenditure, and the functioning of the judiciary. All of that is part of the template that we need to internally discuss to decide what India needs to do for Amrit Kal. Wonderful report. Please read it. Please digest it. Please criticize it. Please imbibe its message. That is how we will get the debate and the discourse going. Thank you very much, IFC. Thank you, Christian, for making the trouble to come all the way. Thank you, Amit, wherever you are.
Thank you, Dr. Broy. Can we just get into the panel discussion now? We have the stakeholder group who was really involved in this exercise. So we really wanted to involve them in terms of understanding what is their view. So can I now request Akshi Jindal to join us on stage? And you can start from in that order from my left. Ashish, no, please, not right now. Ashish, if you could, Mr. Das, Mr. Gurcharan Das, Hari is going to be joining online from Zoom. Then we have Himanshu, who's flown all the way from Bombay. Ravi Venkateshan. Ravi was not able to join us in person because he has COVID, so he decided that he will be in Bangalore. So Ravi Venkateshan, and then Sumant. Sumant, if you could just have you on stage, please. So Akshi, Ashish, Mr. Das, and then Himanshu, and then Sumant. Akshi, you have to go on that side, please. On the left. So thank you all for really joining this very interesting discussion. And thanks to Ravi and Hari for joining on Zoom. But I must personally thank all of you for really giving so much of your time towards this exercise. I think Christian would agree, even Mike Porter will agree, that we couldn't have really done it without you. And you have been a pillar of support from the very beginning in terms of like how we were going through this process. But let's get into the discussion. But my first question, Akshi, would be to you. And then how do we, since you've been working with Bormalt and you're very closely associated with agriculture, and we were talking about agriculture in some ways in the report as well, and I'm sure you've seen the report beforehand as well. But how do you think we work towards enhancing productivity within the agricultural value chain? What steps should we be taking? And what are your insights?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me here. It's been an amazing experience. In terms of agriculture, I mean, we already mentioned a lot of things that can be done. A few things that I'd like to reiterate are the income disparity in the agriculture sector, and your logistics and the expense of logistics in the agriculture sector. And lastly, is the quality of seeds that we use. If I expand a little bit, we have great seeds. We have great scientists who made seeds that are more resilient, give us better yields, but the adoption still is very scattered. It's far in between. And we've seen some great examples wherein we've seen high adoption rates, for instance, in potatoes, in tomatoes for ketchup and chips, but it hasn't happened industry-wide. And that's one area we should definitely look at. In terms of logistics, it's still very expensive to transport all agriculture commodities or store them. While a lot of work is happening in this segment, considering of refrigerated warehouses, a lot of aggregators around transport, but it still continues to be a very, very expensive gambit. And I think we were talking about India playing a larger role in the global food basket. And I think an efficient logistics will definitely help us get there because it reduces our wastage and also gets us price parity to our global competitors. And lastly, of course, is the income disparity. There is a lot of work that has been done on this, but we are not where we should be. In terms of, if I talk about our overall employment is one of the highest sectors. I think we're at 45% as per the report, but we're only 20% of the GDP. And while there are programs around to help it, again, adoption is very slow. So if you take adding horticulture or adding fruits or adding cattle or various other income brackets to the agri society, it's taking its time, but it's not there yet. Another possible income source for the agriculture society can be biofuel. We are looking at husk or ethanol now readily, and husk today is trading at 8-9 rupees, which can really add a lot of value to the farmer base. And same with ethanol. I think the number of plants coming up or soon should be up and running should definitely add income value to the farmer base. But I was looking at there was this map of India, which had these pockets of growth, and it's the same with agriculture. You have these pockets, where they've done immensely well, and they've imbibed all of these things and more. And we can, of course, use them as showcases to be able to imbibe this in other places.
Thank you, Akshay. But we'll just quickly run into the other set of people, and I'll come back to you. I'll have a follow-on question, but some important points here from you on logistics and how do we really improve it. And that could actually be a very huge positive productivity multiplier. In fact, let me get Hari into the conversation. Hari, we were saying a lot of things on convergence of social progress and the idea of economic development. You have been working within the philanthropy sector. You have really done a lot of work within the country as BMGF. I think one of the most prolific firms or philanthropy endeavors within the country. What is your view as to how philanthropy possibly needs to change? What more needs to be done? How we can involve enterprises more in terms of creating that whole idea of social progress and economic development? Hari, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Amit, and congratulations again to Professor Porter, Christian, you, and all the others involved in this report. Very timely and a lot of food for thought. As Dr. Debroy indicated, I think it's incumbent on all of us to really get into the details of the report and then, figure out the appropriate adaptations to India's context and realities, keeping in mind, the huge variations across the country. I think the mandate, so to speak, for philanthropies comes out very clearly from, Christian's presentation. And I think many elements, are reflected in our work in India, and others, I think, could do with further deepening and strengthening. So I think there are, 4 broad areas that I think, are very relevant for, philanthropies and foundations. And I'd say, private foundations, corporate foundations, etc., to keep in mind on how they can contribute to this vision of Amrit Kal and, inclusive prosperity as we look at the next 25 years. So one is, I think, the whole comment, Christian made early on about, shared prosperity. I mean, what it entails and the inclusive social progress that is required for, all of India to benefit from many of the advances in development and economic growth that we've seen over the last, few decades. And I think philanthropies, by virtue of the flexibility have and our ability to not be guided necessarily by market incentives and signals, can focus on the populations, the geographies, the sectors that are not necessarily amenable to intervention by the private sector, and really to work alongside the government and absolutely not substitute for government by looking at ways that equity gaps, whether they be in terms of access, whether it's because of special barriers faced by groups like women and girls, that those can be addressed. So that shared prosperity dimension, I think, is important for all philanthropies and foundations to factor into their work. The second one, I think, also came up quite clearly, the relative siloization between social development actors and economic planning actors. And that's actually, it may exist in Delhi, but I think the gaps in the states are even starker. And we work in many of the more challenging geographies of India as districts, blocks, etc. And I think there is absolutely no connect between what happens on social sector action and the overall economic planning paradigm. And I think there's probably a need to strengthen the connection of institutions. And I think these need to be local institutions that are embedded in the local milieu and not like artificial constructs that philanthropy can sometimes end up creating. So again, how can that enabling local institutions and strengthening them be done at the state level to strengthen the connect between social policy and implementation and economic planning and growth? A third, and I guess this is something that is specifically relevant to the Gates Foundation, may or may not be relevant to all foundations. I think there is a role we can also play in selectively engaging to strengthen and increase the competitiveness of certain sectors, that India already has strengths in. For example, on the whole pharmaceuticals, medical devices, diagnostics, there is an opportunity to engage in the way that we have with India's vaccine manufacturing sector, where support we provided over the last 2 decades has been a contributing factor in India emerging as the global leader in cost-effective, quality-assured vaccines. And I think there is a lot that we could do in the other areas I mentioned. And another one is digital innovation. India has shown over the last 8 years how inclusive digital transformation can actually lift all boats. There's a lot of homegrown innovation that has happened in this area, which I think the world has not yet fully understood the consequences and implications of, and India is at the forefront. And I think fostering more innovation in that space for the global south is an area where we at least could do more. And I think in general it's probably important for philanthropy, which can deploy risk capital, to create innovation ecosystems outside of the the 4 or 5 big clusters in India that currently generate a lot of innovation. And the last area I'd say for philanthropy to keep in mind is again going back to the point I mentioned about we are almost the purest form of risk capital. So to take risks on behalf of the government, whether it's in terms of trying out new operating models to bridge last mile access and equity issues in challenging geographies, or for population segments who are excluded, or even testing out new technology solutions that can help play that role. So I think a lot of risk taking needs to happen. I think there are times when philanthropy plays the safe game. You construct another school or you construct another hospital, which certainly there's nothing wrong with doing that, but you're not actually contributing to the game-changing growth prospects of the country if you're not taking some of these risks. So I think those are the 4 areas I think that I take away from this report. And thanks a lot again, Amit, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Hari. In fact, this is where I would like to get Himanshu, you into the conversation. Like Hari talks about the whole set of transformation that has happened, especially talking about digital transformation. But we have seen one of the biggest transformations in India in the last 5 years, and that was Swachh Bharat. And you have been in an enterprise which is all about cleanliness and as the diversity seen there and things. But then my question to you is like, how has something like Swachh Bharat, or how the whole endeavor towards cleanliness leads towards productivity? Because that is a very transformational experience that we have seen.
This is the first time the head of a government has put a focus on cleanliness as a way to exist. And I would say India is a very fortunate country where that level of focus has come. The lack of cleanliness is an issue in many, many, many countries, especially in the developing world. But the focus we brought in was very different. And the results are there for all of us to see. There's a competitive atmosphere among cities. But the important difference is this is about litter-free and waste management. This does not make you hygienic or free of diseases, etc. It helps but does not take that away. And I think there's a time for us at some stage to look in terms of better hygiene. And that involves a couple of dimensions. It's pretty well understood. There are a lot of studies on that topic. The better the cleanliness is more about upkeep and visible physical cleanliness. And then comes hygiene. They lead to a direct improvement in productivity and the competitiveness of the workforce. The number of studies across, right from Africa to Netherlands to US, and we can go through them. Now, what does it relate to? The most immediate benefit comes out of absenteeism reduction, health improvement. Next is motivation. People are more motivated to work in a clean atmosphere. It's been tried even in Indian, I would say public administration, where a certain collector goes and cleans up the office and improves the upkeep. The productivity of the department goes up. So it's a very common thing. We all like a clean space. Unfortunately, the importance given to it in our day-to-day lives is less than what it can be or should be. So it's seen as a chore. It's seen to be it's an automatic thing. It is seen as something which will get done by somebody somewhere, out of sight, out of mind. And I think that is something which, if we pay a little attention to it, it plays a marvelous role. A company as small as Diversity, a very small company, I would say. We are less than $100 million in India. But if I look at if I should tell you the impact, in the last 5 years, we have given employment to about 32,000 people by training them to become hygiene technicians, all out of our own. We've created about an opportunity to save 3 billion liters of water every year by reducing the water used in cleaning. So there is a whole lot of impact there. Apart, I'm not measuring the productivity. We have improved the hygiene, productivity, as in the effort, resources used in cleanliness by 10% easily year on year. But the impact on the people working in that cleaner environment is something which we have not really captured anywhere. So it is a huge multiplier, just that it needs a little more attention. That's the way I'll put it.
Thank you, Himanshu. So Sumant, just following up from what Himanshu had said, like you are an industry which has been a transformation in many ways. Like India is now becoming net energy positive in many ways. Of course, there are some gaps, etc. But with the kind of climate crisis that we are seeing, we will have to move into a direction wherein we get cleaner energy and stuff. But what do you think is going to be the role of new business model in your industry? What are the transformations that we will have to make as a role for business? What government needs to do, and what the future holds for us? So much.
Well, thank you for that, Amit. And I'd like to compliment you and, of course, Christian and Professor Porter for this fantastic report. I think it's very important as we embark on the next 25 years to have a roadmap and a sense of what needs to be done. Clearly, look, our sector, as you rightly pointed out, is the clean energy transition area, the climate change area, and within that, I would say that in terms of what we need to do, look, the reality is that corporates will carry on doing whatever is in their best commercial interest as long as possible, unless they're actually told to change their behavior in certain ways. And the climate change crisis is clearly an area where the message has now come loud and clear to the corporate sector that we cannot carry on in terms of business as usual, and changes have to be made. And I think it's because, as you rightly pointed out in the report as well, we've already had 1 degree centigrade temperature change, and we're looking at another 1.5 degrees to happen in the next 20 to 30 years fairly soon. And if we carry on as normal, that is going to actually impact us. And we've already seen the consequences of that happening in droughts, in floods, in climate change, in various other and different ways. So I think the imperative, the compulsion to change is very clear. Now, how does that translate to how we might do different business models, what the government might be doing? So I think, look, every part of the whole section of the government and corporates have to get together, including civil society, to make this change happen, because it's a very transformational change. It's not a small change. It's a massive change. So far, our entire industrial complex has been based on emitting carbon, burning fossil fuels. And that has to change. And that's not an easy task, given how fundamental energy is to everything that we do. Our very way of life is sort of based on that. So this whole fundamental change that has to happen is not an easy one. Now, we have made significant progress in that, in terms of recognizing the problem, and we are now beginning to start changing the things that do need to be changed. Now, for example, as we all know, the government, I think, when this government came in 2014, clearly took the view that India had to be part of the solution of finding and doing whatever we could do. And the reason for that was that and the government recognized that India is going to be as vulnerable as any other country would be, and therefore it was important for us to find a role in finding the right solution. Now, what has happened since then is that the government has now set a target of 450 gigawatts, going up to 500 gigawatts of clean energy capacity to be set up by 2030, which is terrific. But the reality is that that is not going to be sufficient for us, just in terms of the sheer demand growth that we're going to witness by that point in time. And so we will continue to have some degree of more coal coming in as well. But I do believe that by 2030, we should reach peak coal, and after that, coal will start phasing out. In terms of new business models, to address your question directly, is, look, first of all, there is pressure on corporates to change, not just in the way they get their energy, which of course is now moving to clean energy sources, and that is now fairly visible and fairly straightforward, but in also everything else that they do. So if you look at the hard-to-abate industries like steel, cement, and so on, clearly there is an effort now that on them and a pressure on them to decarbonize. And so now they are working on business models to figure out how that decarbonization can happen. It's not easy and it's not cheap, but there is pressure coming on them from the global sort of investing community, from the government, as well as from other governments and other parts of the world where they want to export their products. And so therefore, all of that is leading to pressure on corporates to start thinking about how to make this change happen. And that is something that we're now seeing much more of. One of the ways that is now emerging as a way to do that clearly is through the area of green hydrogen. And so therefore, you will see more and more movement and progress happening over the next 5 to 10 years towards developing green hydrogen as a potential, as a replacement of gray hydrogen as a feedstock, and also as a replacement of LNG eventually, especially with the volatility in gas prices. That's something that is now becoming quite viable and possible. So I think you will see that certainly changing. Now, on the consumption side, you'll also see a lot of changes happening as civil society begins to do their bit to move to a more decarbonized lifestyle. For example, electric vehicles or putting solar on rooftops. And again, corporates have a very important role to play in developing the right products and making sure that they get disseminated as rapidly as possible. Now, while corporates do that, government also has a very important role in making sure the right sets of policies and incentives come into play as well. And there is pressure on both consumers as well as on industries to make that transition happen faster than slower. Otherwise, left to themselves and left to their own devices, people will just carry on in the status quo way. So I think that's where government has to play an important role, which is to make sure that these targets get set, policies get mandated, and people have to, in some ways, start moving in that direction. And when that happens and you create a bit of the industry, that's when the opportunity for bringing costs really to come down in these new age industries begins to come in. And that's really what, the role that corporates have to play is to make that cost come down and make this whole transition become a lot less costly than it might otherwise be.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Ravi, this is where I would like to get you in. In fact, you've worked so much on entrepreneurship, and we did talk about the role of business and as what Sumant was alluding to. But my question to you would be, what more needs to be done? How do we overcome the challenge of scale within the country? How do we really overcome the challenge of, say, missing middle, if we might want to say? Because that's, if we are able to do that, if we are able to make our firms more productive, India actually gets onto a journey which is going to be very, very different. And that is what is going to be the difference, as Dr. De Broglie was saying, from 8.99% to either 9.01% over 365. Over to you, please. So, Ravi, you're on mute, it seems.
Sorry, even after 2 years, I haven't mastered the art of unmuting. So I was just going to say congratulations for the wonderful report, and in particular, Christian. I want to congratulate Christian for his presentation. which spoke about some difficult truths in the most constructive and very tactful manner. So I thought the report, and Christian in his presentation also did a fantastic job focusing on clearly one of the most important challenges we face today, Amit, which is jobs and employment. And, he said, it reminded us how big that challenge is and how structural it is. And then he went on to talk about the missing middle of enterprises. What is this missing middle? It turns out that the vast majority of our 63 million enterprises are informal, stunted, and employ less than 10 people. And only in the report, it made a very interesting point that 350 companies, exactly 350 of them account for 55% of corporate earnings. So what we have is not enough really successful firms like Renew Power, for instance, and a huge base of nano enterprises which are unproductive, and this gap in between. And of course, these two are completely related phenomena, because in any well-functioning, balanced economy, it is the growth of a large number of small firms into mid-sized one, and then a few becoming larger, that creates a big number of jobs. And for well over a decade, the escalator has been broken. And as you alluded in your introduction, it's something we've been spending a lot of time on. What we've learned, Amit, is fascinating. Getting the existing set of firms to start growing again and creating jobs is not easy. Okay. And it turns out that firms that start out informal rarely formalize. They tend to remain informal and therefore stunted, etc. And also, the evidence, in fact, by Anant Nageshwaran, our CEA, says that firms that are formal tend to be more productive and capable of growth. So what we realized is, look, we need a massive wave of entrepreneurship, new breed of firms that start out with a growth mindset, start out formal, and are capable of growing. And if we can get 10 million of them to sort of get going, that over time can create 100 million jobs. I think Christian also made a really good point, which, look, in any economy, things happen not because of policy. It happens because of people. Particularly, it happens because of entrepreneurs, right? And so if India is going to continue to grow her GDP, there's going to be mass prosperity, if you're going to be self-reliant, if you're going to move to a net zero economy, what we need is a large number of entrepreneurs. And we probably need 1,000 world-class entrepreneurs like my friend Suman. But if you need 1,000 of these big ones, then you need a funnel of 10 million entrepreneurs starting out on the journey. And we've seen this phenomenon, Amit and friends, in sports. We see this happening in cricket. As we democratized and many more people started playing, we got many more world-beating cricketers. We're seeing this now in chess, and now we need to replicate this in entrepreneurship. What we've seen in the last few years is through some fairly effective interventions in cities like Ludhiana and Mangalore, we're able to jumpstart this whole movement. And we've now also learned, Amit, that the building blocks to take this kind of intervention to scale already exists. For instance, in every district, there is physical infrastructure ranging from what are called DICs, district industries centers, to RCETs. And these could be revitalized quickly as incubators and accelerators. As the report notes, we already have a plethora of central government and state government schemes that are good on intent for all this and have budgets, but need some redesign and also convergence and rationalization. Christian made a very good point about, look, we may have aced the World Bank exams, but on the ground, life is still pretty hard if you're a first-time entrepreneur or a small business. But what we've learned is wherever there's political will and leadership at the state level, we're able to actually work together to debottleneck procedures and rules and regulations so entrepreneurs can grow quickly. So what I think we need to do is figure out how to take all this into mission mode. And so, Param Iyer at Niti Aayog has this idea, and I don't know if he's in the audience, that maybe it's time for a national entrepreneurship mission, which Niti launches, which can actually take all this work and put it on steroids. And can we, over the decade, create 10 million new entrepreneurs or enterprises who create 100 million jobs, and at least a quarter of them should be women? I mean, the entrepreneurs, not the jobs. And I really like that idea. Whenever you look at where the country has made huge progress in a short time, whether it's renewable energy or it's Aadhaar or Swachh Bharat, it's been through a mission mode sort of project. And maybe the time is right now for a national entrepreneurship mission. So that's what I would suggest in terms of how we operationalize what you're pointing out in the report, what we know and have learned, and get a lot of things done in a short time.
Thank you, Ravi. And we have to close this session in the next 3 minutes, please. So, Ashish, over to you for exactly 60 seconds. What do you think technology can do to overcome the gap of education?
So maybe technology can help us there. Just very quickly, one of the biggest challenges in education is we can't get the change quick enough across India, right? Technology plays a huge role. We for instance, if you look at rural districts, if you look at schools, if the teacher is just provided with enough technology, I think change can happen very quickly. And education is the foundation at the end of the day, right? We can talk about everything else here, but if we don't start with the foundation, at education at the foundational level, it's not going to go up in the next 20 years or 25 years. And I think technology plays a huge role. The one point I do want to make on technology is we are investing heavily in it. The only problem we have is it's not a cohesive strategy. We are going in, investing in smart classrooms, tablets, etc., but nobody's looking at how do we bring outcomes when we put it all together. So, making sure you get your 60 seconds. I think as long as we can get a cohesive plan together on technology, education or otherwise, I think it's not going to work.
That's beautiful, Ashish. Thank you. Mr. Das, the final word from you on how do we design the new institutional architecture? And we did allude to that in the report as well. Your 60 seconds starting now.
I interpret your question as a very practical person to mean, how do we translate thought into action? How do we translate this report into an implementation? And the competitiveness touches every central ministry, touches every state government. And we know that these are silos and these are unwieldy structures. And the only coordinator in our system is the Prime Minister, and even he doesn't have much control over state chief ministers. So I have a suggestion which many of you will find controversial, but it is really to have a competitiveness czar at the level of a deputy prime minister of the country. Ideally, it should be the prime minister, but he has other things to do. So the job here is not to create a super ministry. It's not to add people into a department, but to bring very high level power. So it can't be a bureaucrat. At a high level political power, political will is the word we've been talking about in this activity, in order to raise competitiveness into the top of the mind of the country, onto the radar of every ministry. And this particular individual will have to be a special kind of leader who will use skills of coordination, of motivation, of nudging, of communication. Remember Margaret Thatcher used to say that I spend 20% of my time reforming and 80% of our time selling the reforms. None of our reformers has done that from 1991 onwards, not one. And so I would say we're not talking, as I again repeat, adding people to a ministry, but really having the political clout to work with the current system to deliver results such as, for example, enforcing contracts where we score one of the lowest in the world, solving the problem of high tariffs which prevent exports, skill shortages in specific sectors, how to bring women into the workplace, things identified by Christian, improving the cost of doing business, education outcomes, and so on, logistics. So with that, my 60 seconds are up, and that's my answer to you.
So I think on this note, we'll close the panel, but I would request each one of you to give us time. We'll have detailed conversations on this and really move forward. But having said that, I think I and Christian and Professor Porter are convinced if there is one person who can really drive this change, it is the Prime Minister. As you say, he has many more things to do, but I think this is one more responsibility that he can possibly look at and really drive the change. So that is where thanks a lot for everybody on the panel. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Harish. Thank you. So can we have a picture together? Thank you. So thank you all for being here. But now we'll just move towards the end of the program. Mr. Kant had to leave because he had some other meeting that had come up. But I would request Sanjeev, who is the member of the Economic Advisory Council, and I look forward to his comments in terms of like what he thinks, what he sees out here. And I would like him to, I'll request him to speak on the Amrit Kal reforms and things like. So Sanjeev, over to you. And we have exactly 10 minutes for you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. Let me begin by congratulating the Institute of Competitiveness and specifically Professors Porter, Professor Kettles, Professor Kapoor on producing this very well written report on the competitiveness roadmap for India at 100, i.e. for 2047. And of course, a report like this is very difficult to write because you're dealing with vast stretches of time. You're dealing with a vast canvas. So not surprisingly, the report has a very wide range of issues that it discusses and presents. But I think it's a useful set of recommendations for the following reasons. First of all, what it does is it takes this rather amorphous idea of competitiveness and puts it in a framework. This is not a trivial thing to do because what it does is it first of all provides a sense of priorities. It provides a sense of the combinations of things that should be done. Now, in order to appreciate what I mean, perhaps we should step back and go back 25 years back to think about how this report would have looked if we had attempted to write it at that time. Now, since I was at that time in the private sector, and I was part of similar exercises. Of course, I was very young, so I was mostly assisting other people more senior than myself writing such reports. But it is quite clear that a report like this written 25 years back would have actually emphasized very different things. And that gives a sense of how things have changed over this period. So if we go back and I think about the kinds of reports that were written in 1997, the two things that would have been sort of the center of a report like this would have been, first of all, the idea of deregulation, which would have been the centerpiece. So although India went into, began to do its liberalization in 1991-92, even in 1997, very large proportion of the economy would have still been heavily regulated or in various ways constrained by a license permit mindset, if not by actual rules and regulations and so on. And one of the things that strikes me here is that although there is mention of further smoothing and so on, this idea of the withdrawal of the state is not central to this report. And that is quite stunning. A report in 1997 would definitely have struck on the withdrawal of the state from doing the things it should not do. The second thing that would have been a very important part of the report at that point of time would have been the need for better infrastructure. Reports written in the end of the 90s or the early 2000s would have gone on and on about how our highways are terrible, our airports are terrible, and so on and so forth. Again, a big change that has happened. I mean, I'm not saying that India's infrastructure is perfect, but certainly, especially if you visit much of the West, and one of the things that strikes you when you come back is actually the airports at our end are better. And for large parts of the country now, our highways are world-class. Electricity supply, while intermittent in some places, is generally available. Regular. I grew up in the Kolkata of the 1980s and early 90s, and I remember there being 6-7 hours of power cuts even in the middle of a major metro city. So those kinds of things are certainly the infrastructure, while not perfect, is something that we have definitely made a lot of progress on. And I can say that while it is, of course, we can still improve, but it is not the binding constraint of economic growth anymore that it used to be. So the question, therefore, is 25 years on, what are the things that are the issues that we now think about? And here, I think the competitiveness report brings out something that is quite interesting, in that its focus is on getting the government to do better the things it should be doing. So this is the big change, from stopping the government from doing the things it should not be doing, but to get the government to do better the things it should be doing. And in this context, it actually talks about something that's quite dear to my heart, which is the issue of internal coordination and breaking of silos. That's a theme that comes regularly out throughout it, that if you want the government to do the things it needs to do, you need an all-of-government approach. In fact, I would go one step forward. We need an all-of-India approach, because we even need to get the private sector on board on this. And in this context, there is a lot of emphasis in the report, those who will read it, is in doing this. And incidentally, as somebody who's now spent 5.5 years working in the government, this is something that really strikes you, is that there is something called a department view that you will all come across. And this is an utterly absurd idea. The idea is that what on earth is a department view? Either it's a view that takes forward the interests of the country forward, or it doesn't. Taking forward the interests of a specific department seems to be a rather pointless activity. But much of government functions in this specific, the architecture of it is set up to do this. And so you have very often the rather odd situation that a particular civil servant will give a particular view while in a particular department, will switch to another department and make the exact opposite case. And it's considered a perfectly kosher activity. Now, that is a reflection of this particular line of or approach. And as somebody who spent a lot of time working in other countries, this is something that, when very rarely faces in other parts of the world. So this is something I think that really, by highlighting this and making it an issue, I think that would be something that we can take forward. My own view is that this will not get solved by having a competitiveness czar. So sorry, Gurcharan, I don't agree with you, because this is a cultural problem. Getting yet another person on top trying to, the competitiveness czars sort of forcing this coordination is not going to work, because all you will get is now the competitiveness czar's departmental view. What you really need is to break down this whole culture. And, I think I'm not quite sure how to do this, but it certainly needs to be highlighted through reports, through public debate, that this sort of approach needs to be really put into the dustbins of history. Now, looking ahead, as you all know, that no good deed goes unpunished. So looking ahead, I hope this report is followed up by some more targeted reports at specific problems that arise out of many of the things that you have highlighted. For example, you have, since I mentioned this issue of all of government approach, it would be very useful to us here in the Prime Minister's Economic Council to get a sense of specific areas where this coordination problem really breaks down. And what is it that we could do in those areas? Are there rules and regulations that end up mandating this behavior? Are there other ways of thinking about it? Transparency, sharing of data. It would be very, very useful for us if you can put in action in some ways specific to a area, how we can actually go about it. And then that helps us then to actually begin to try and do this. So as a partner in the implementation of this, it would be very, very helpful if you can specifically work out some of these things. Now, it is not the case that we will necessarily agree with your prognosis or your solution, but since this is this whole effort of reaching out to organizations like the Institute of Competitiveness for external ideas, and it's in keeping with the Rigvedic dictum that let all ideas come from all directions. Now, of course, as I said, as for those of us in government, we will not always agree with you. That's fine. But indeed, there have been other reports by the Institute of Competitiveness where I personally have not agreed. For example, I think there was an earlier report a few months ago which recommended universal basic income. I, for one, don't think that's appropriate for India. I much prefer the more targeted approach at dealing with absolute poverty that we have been using so far through schemes like Ujjwala or Jan Dhan Yojana and so on. So I have a different view on it, but that shouldn't in any way constrain you in the sense that it's good to get systematic feedback done from a particular vantage point, and that's why I like the use of the Porter framework, because it means that whatever it is that you are proposing, they are systematic, they're internally consistent, and that really helps us to think through various issues. So with that, let me stop and say congratulations once more to all of you, and specifically to Professors Porter, Kettle, and Kapoor for putting together this report. I know that a lot of hard work goes into it, so congratulations, and look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I think I would just like to say one thing, and there are some set of principles that we have talked about. And the big thing from my point of view is about the 4S framework, and that Christian did allude to, and he was talking about it. Like, one is social, shared, sustainable, and solid. How do we really imbibe this framework across the departments within the government? How do we really look at pushing the idea to the states and even possibly to the cities? And I think most of you will agree with us on that. And as for the further or the next steps, and as Sanjeev was saying, that we would look at doing some better or deeper work, wherein we would like to look at building this further at the ministerial level or various ministries level, look at how this can actually be looked at for various sets of industries, and possibly at the level of states as we move forward. And then, of course, development of KPIs or key performance indicators is going to be very, very critical. But having said that, the most important factor is going to be that we have to look at this whole idea of dual challenge of development, social development and economic development, and that is what we need to move forwards towards. And this report and the framework does help us move into that direction. And without, I think this is where we would like to close the program. It's just been a pleasure to have you all with us today. Special thanks for Christian, or to Christian, for really flying in from Stockholm today. That is where he was. And special thanks to all the stakeholders, all the people who supported us, Avinash, then Ashish, BMGF, who did support all the members of the stakeholder group. But I cannot thank two people enough, and that is Dr. Bibek Debroy and Amitabh Kanji. Like, I think this wouldn't have been possible without their support and explicit support in terms of really pushing us into the direction of really giving an idea which was fairly independent, fiercely independent, and allowing us to say what we wanted to say. And of course, as Sanjeev says, there can always be a huge level of disagreement. We can differ in points of view, but there was a complete level of independence that we were given. But having said that, we look forward to larger view on competitiveness in the country and how this can actually get implemented across the board. So thanks a lot, everybody, for really being with us today. It's been an honor and it's been a pleasure. And I would like to invite everybody for lunch. The lunch would be served at the cafeteria. So anybody and everybody who's here, please welcome and join us for lunch. It'll be an honor and a pleasure. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Debroy. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thanks, everybody. Man. Thank you. Jai Hind. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm Michael Porter, and I'm speaking to you from Harvard Business School today. And I wish I could be there with you because this is one of my favorite meetings of the year. But what I'd like to do is talk to you about really one of the critical topics that CEOs and other business leaders all around the world are thinking about these days. And the general topic is, what's the role of business in advancing society as opposed to doing business? And in particular, at this moment, there's kind of a new focus on this concept of purpose, having a corporate purpose as a sort of unifying theme for how to understand what companies should be doing to make sure that they benefit society. This concept is now very prominent in the U.S. and growing rapidly here. It is starting to be discussed in India, and a few Indian companies have started down this path, but it's not yet begun to gain momentum. And so the purpose of these comments is to sort of give you all a flavor for what is this new idea, where does it fit in the evolution of thinking about this broader topic, and how do we do it well, which is, of course, the most important question. Now, the concept of purpose has been a very useful discussion because it brings more attention to the fact that a company can and should have a positive impact on society. And this is critical today in a time where capitalism is under some attack, particularly here in America and perhaps elsewhere as well. What many people now are believing is, well, capitalism is enriching a few without benefiting many. And we in business, we believe we benefit many, but we have not had an effective way of either thinking about that or talking about that or actually delivering on that. The purpose idea